You open a map of Europe, dozens of countries, tiny borders everywhere. Then you open a map of Latin America. One language family stretches across almost the entire continent. One religion, one colonial ruler for most of it. And yet, somehow you are looking at 20 different countries instead of one giant nation. The real answer is much stranger than geography. It has almost nothing to do with mountains or rivers. It has everything to do with how empires draw invisible lines long before anyone thinks to erase them. You have probably heard the simple explanation. Too much jungle, too many mountains. Impossible to unite. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look closer. The United States crossed deserts, mountain ranges, and thousands of miles of wilderness and still became one country. Russia spans 11 time zones. China holds together despite mountains higher than anything in South America. So why did Spanish America, a region that shared a language, a religion, and a single crown for 300 years, splinter into so many separate nations the moment independence arrived? To understand this, you need to go back before the wars, before the revolutions, before anyone even used the word Latin America. You need to go back to the way Spain actually ran its empire. Spain did not govern its American territories as one single unit. It divided them into separate administrative zones called viceroyalties. New Spain covered Mexico and Central America. New Granada covered what is now Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Peru covered much of the western coast. Rio de la Plata covered Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Each viceroyalty had its own capital, its own courts, its own tax system, and its own governor answering directly to the king in Madrid. These were not provinces of one nation. They were parallel, separate kingdoms that all happened to report to the same crown. This matters more than it sounds like it should. Historian John Lynch, one of the leading scholars of Spanish-American independence, has shown that these administrative boundaries were not arbitrary lines drawn for convenience. They became the skeleton for entirely separate political identities. A merchant in Buenos Aires had almost no contact with a merchant in Mexico City. A lawyer trained in Lima rarely interacted with a lawyer trained in Bogotá. You could travel from Madrid to Lima faster, in many cases, than you could travel between two Spanish-American cities that today sit inside neighboring countries. The empire connected each region to Spain far more tightly than it connected the regions to each other. Now picture the moment the connection to Spain breaks. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and forced the Spanish king to abdicate. Suddenly, the head of the entire imperial system was gone. Across the Americas, local governing councils called juntas sprang up almost overnight, each one claiming authority in the king's name until order could be restored. But here is the strange part. These juntas did not form as one unified body, speaking for all of Spanish America. They formed separately, in each viceroyalty, in each administrative capital, because that is how the empire had trained people to organize power for 300 years. You are watching. In real time, the seeds of separate nations get planted. Not because anyone wanted separate nations, because the only political structures available were the ones the empire had already built, and those structures were regional, not continental. Simon Bolivar understood this danger better than almost anyone alive at the time. He is remembered today as the great unifier, the man who dreamed of a single nation called Gran Colombia, stretching from Venezuela to Peru. What most people forget is that Bolivar spent years watching his own dream collapse in front of him. He warned, in letters and speeches, that the newly independent territories were fracturing along exactly the old viceroyalty lines, and that regional elites in each capital had no intention of giving up local power to a distant central government, even one led by the man who had liberated them. By 1830, the year Bolivar died, Gran Colombia had already split into Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. His final words are often summarized as a lament that he had plowed the sea. He had spent a decade fighting for unity, and watched it dissolve into fragments almost the moment the fighting stopped. Why did this keep happening again and again across the continent? Political scientist Miguel Centeno has studied this pattern closely, comparing how Latin American nations formed compared to nations in Europe and elsewhere. His research points to something counterintuitive. In much of Europe, near constant warfare between rival states forced governments to build strong central institutions, efficient taxation and unified national identities, simply to survive against their neighbors. Latin America, after independence, did not face that same pressure in the same way. The wars that mattered most were fought against Spain, not primarily against each other. When Spain was defeated, there was no equally intense external threat forcing the new republics to consolidate into fewer, larger states. Instead, something almost the opposite happened. Regional elites, the wealthy landowners, merchants and military commanders who had gained power during the independence wars, had strong incentives to keep power local. A regional strongman in Caracas did not want to answer to a president in Bogotá. A wealthy planter in Guatemala did not want tax decisions made in Mexico City. Independence had shattered the Spanish crown's authority, but it replaced that authority with dozens of local power centers, each one reluctant to surrender control to a larger union. There is a deeper layer beneath all of this, one that researcher Benedict Anderson explored in his influential work on nationalism. Anderson argued that nations are, in a very real sense, imagined communities. A nation exists because enough people believe they belong to it, read the same newspapers, share the same stories, and picture themselves as part of the same collective future. In Spanish America, the printing presses, newspapers, and administrative paperwork had circulated almost entirely within each viceroyalty for 3 centuries. A resident of Quito had been reading local news about Quito, not continental news about a shared Spanish-American identity. By the time independence arrived, the imagined community that existed most strongly in people's minds was not Spanish America as a whole. It was the smaller region their grandparents had lived in, worked in, and been taxed in. You can see this play out almost mathematically if you look at Central America. In 1823, the United Provinces of Central America formed as a single federal republic, uniting Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. On paper, this looked exactly like the kind of unified nation that critics say should have emerged everywhere. It lasted barely 17 years. Regional rivalries, competing economic interests, and the same lack of a unifying external threat tore it apart by 1841, leaving 5 separate countries where one had briefly existed. Notice, too, how quickly the pattern repeated itself once a larger union tried to reform. Bolivar was not naive. He saw the fragmentation coming and tried to counter it with sheer political will. Calling for a Congress in Panama in 1826 meant to bind the newly independent nations into a lasting alliance. Delegates from several countries did attend. Almost nothing came of it. Distances were too great, communication too slow, and each delegation arrived more interested in protecting its own new nation's interests than in surrendering sovereignty to a shared body. The Panama Congress is remembered today less as a founding moment and more as a preview of every failed unity attempt that would follow it for the next 2 centuries. Compare this to what happened in Brazil, and the picture becomes even stranger. Brazil, a Portuguese colony rather than a Spanish one, stayed remarkably intact after independence in 1822. Why? Because Portugal governed Brazil differently. Rather than dividing it into competing administrative zones, the way Spain divided its territories, the Portuguese royal family actually relocated to Brazil in 1808, fleeing Napoleon, and ruled the colony as a single unified kingdom from Rio de Janeiro. When independence came, Brazil already had one functioning central monarchy, one capital, and one administrative structure that the entire territory was accustomed to obeying. Brazil did not fragment the way Spanish America did, because it never had the same fragmented starting point. This is the twist that reframes everything you thought you knew. Latin America did not fail to unite because the people were too different, or the terrain too difficult, or the dream too ambitious. It fragmented because the empire that created it was never actually one empire to begin with. It was a collection of separate kingdoms wearing a single crown, and when that crown fell, each kingdom simply reverted to governing itself, the way it always had. Think about what this means for how you see maps today. You look at a border and assume it reflects something natural, some deep cultural or geographic truth about where one people ends and another begins. But the border between Colombia and Venezuela does not trace a mountain range or a river that separates two ancient civilizations. It traces, almost exactly, the boundary of an 18th century Spanish administrative district. The border between Guatemala and Mexico echoes the edge of a colonial jurisdiction that had nothing to do with the people living inside it and everything to do with how efficiently Spain wanted to collect taxes and manage courts from a distance. You do something similar every day without realizing it. You inherit categories. School districts, time zones, even the shape of your own city were often drawn by people who died centuries ago for reasons that no longer apply to your life. You treat these lines as fixed facts about the world. They were choices made by specific people for specific administrative convenience, and then frozen in place by habit and by the sheer difficulty of redrawing anything once enough generations have grown up believing the line was always there. Consider, too, how language itself misled generations of observers into expecting unity. You hear the term Latin America, and your mind groups it together instantly, the way you might group Scandinavia or the Balkans. But a shared language does not automatically produce a shared political will. Think about the English-speaking world. Britain, the United States, Australia, and Canada all share a language, and yet nobody expects them to merge into a single government. Language tells you how people communicate. It does not tell you who they trust with power, who collects their taxes, or who commands their loyalty when a crisis hits. Spanish speakers in Buenos Aires and Spanish speakers in Caracas could read the same newspapers in theory, but in practice they almost never did, because the physical distance and the colonial infrastructure never connected the two cities in any meaningful way. You might wonder whether geography really played no role at all. It played a role, but not the leading one people assume. The Andes Mountains, the Amazon Basin, and the sheer distances involved certainly made travel and communication difficult. But difficulty is not destiny. Russia is larger than all of Latin America combined, crossing frozen tundra, deserts, and mountain ranges, and it remained one state for centuries under a strong, centralized bureaucracy. The difference was never simply the distance between 2 points on a map. The difference was whether a functioning institution existed that made people on both ends of that distance believe they were part of the same political project. Spain built institutions that discouraged exactly that belief by design. Because a fragmented colonial administration was easier for a distant crown to control than a single, powerful, unified viceroyalty capable of asserting its own independence, there is also the matter of race and class, which shaped who actually held power once independence arrived, and therefore shaped what kind of unity, if any, those elites wanted to pursue. The wars of independence were led largely by criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas, who wanted the same privileges as peninsular Spaniards born in Europe, without necessarily wanting to share power more broadly with indigenous populations, enslaved people, or mixed-race majorities. Historian John Charles Chasteen has written extensively about how these criollo elites, once in power, prioritized protecting their own regional economic interests over any grand continental project. A landowner in one province had far more to gain from controlling his local government directly than from being one voice among many in a distant federal capital. Unity, from this perspective, often looked like a threat to local privilege, rather than an opportunity for collective strength. You can trace this same pattern into the 20th century, long after the original independence wars had ended. Attempts at regional cooperation kept surfacing. Simon Bolivar's dream never fully died. Organizations formed, treaties were signed, trade agreements were proposed. Yet almost every serious attempt at deeper political union stalled for the same underlying reasons that broke apart Gran Colombia and the United Provinces of Central America in the first place. Local elites, entrenched national identities built up over a century or more of separate existence, and economies still oriented toward trade with distant global powers rather than with neighboring countries, all worked against consolidation. By the time serious unity was even discussed again, each country had spent 100 years building its own school systems, its own military, its own currency, and its own sense of national pride. Asking people to give that up in favor of an abstract continental identity was, and remains, a much harder sell than it would have been in the earlier years, before those separate identities had time to calcify. This is where the story loops back to something personal, something closer to your own life than a map of 19th century South America might suggest. You live inside institutions and boundaries that feel permanent, but almost all of them were built by specific decisions, made by specific people, for reasons that often had nothing to do with your convenience or your identity. A company's org chart, a school's zoning boundary, even a family's unspoken rules about who makes which decisions. These things feel like fixed facts once you grow up inside them. But they were built the same way Spain's viceroyalties were built, piece by piece, decision by decision, until the structure hardened into something that felt inevitable, even though it never was. The next time you look at a map and wonder why the borders sit where they do, remember that the answer is rarely about mountains or rivers. It is almost always about who was keeping records, who was collecting taxes, and who those records and taxes trained people to think of as their government, centuries before anyone thought to ask whether it could have been drawn any other way. There is one more piece of this story worth sitting with. Economic historians studying the region point out that even after independence, each new country's economy tended to connect more strongly to Europe or the United States than to its neighbors. Coffee from Colombia sailed to European ports. Silver from Mexico moved along trade routes built for colonial extraction, not regional integration. The railways, when they eventually arrived, were built to move resources out to the coast for export, not to connect one Latin American capital to another. The physical infrastructure of the region reinforced the same pattern the administrative history had already set in motion. Everything pointed outward, toward the old colonial centers of power, and almost nothing pointed sideways toward unity between neighbors. So when you ask why Latin America never became one country, you are really asking a question about the difference between shared culture and shared institutions. Shared language and shared religion turned out not to be enough. What mattered was the invisible architecture of governance. The courts, the tax offices, the printing presses, the roads, all built along separate regional lines for 300 years before anyone dreamed of independence. By the time unity became possible, the habits of separation were already older than anyone alive to fight for a different outcome. Bolivar's dream did not fail because it was impossible. It failed because it arrived after the deeper, quieter work of division had already been done, generation after generation, paperwork after paperwork, border after border, long before a single shot was fired for independence. Now think again about that map you opened at the beginning. 20 countries where you expected one. It is not a story about geography defeating unity. It is a story about how the smallest, most boring administrative decisions, made by distant bureaucrats centuries ago, can outlive empires, outlive wars, and quietly shape the borders you take for granted today. Paste this into 11 labs to generate the audio. Once you have the audio exported, run it through Descript, Otter.ai, Adobe Premiere, or YouTube Studio to get the timestamped transcript. Then paste that back here, and I'll build the correct image prompts and metadata for it.